Margaret Lascia Corla, and before
that the bill be now read a second time.
That the bill be now read a second time. Before I introduce it, I just want to say quite openly and publicly that People Before Profit sends its full sympathy and solidarity to the family of the late and great Christy Dignam. And I would say that if he was alive today, he'd be fully in support of this bill. My experience of him was when he played in Ballyfermot in the 90s in a local venue. It used to be packed to the gills, full of young people who really got him and he really got them. He understood young people in working class areas. He was of them, he was part of them, and he fully expressed their experience in life. And not so long ago, on behalf of the National Homeless and Housing Coalition, which People Before Profit were very much part of, he worked with Francis Black and with other musicians like Don Baker to make an album or a song called We All Fall Down about homelessness, for homelessness, and to be used as a fundraiser for campaigning. So we want to thank him for that and to credit him and his life with being very full and rich in terms of the contribution he made both politically and culturally to Irish society and Oireachtas Garo Anam Yeelish. So I'll move the bill, and I want to start, funny enough, by thanking a member of our own staff, Nicole, who works in Paul office, wrote this bill, ironically because of her own direct experience of working for sub-minimum rates. She was a young worker in a Santa's grotto, and Santa, of course, thought it was okay to pay her 80% of the legal minimum wage, while her colleagues who did the same work and dealt with the same children got the full rate of pay. And she isn't alone in having that experience. According to the CSO, over 150,000 people are on the minimum wage, 34,000 are on sub-minimum wage rates. And of these, half are on rates determined solely by their age. They're not apprentices, they're not training or simply gaining experience. They do not work for fun or for pocket money. They're workers who do the same work alongside others who work with them. But this state passed legislation to say it's okay, based on your age, to pay you less. If this was any other category of work, we would clearly see it for what it is and would never be acceptable. It's discrimination, it's exploitation, and it has to stop. And that's why this bill, we are bringing it here today to try and stop it in the here and now. There's no case for continuing with these rates. There never was a case for them. But now, in the cost of living crisis, at this time of historic highs in energy, rents, mortgages, travel, groceries, the idea that it's okay to pay young people less for doing the same work must stop, and it has to be seen for what it is. It's wrong. When the National Minimum Wage Bill was brought in 2000 by the then Minister Mary Harney, the reduced rates were justified in the following way. The Minister said, "All other things being equal, an experienced employee is of more value and more productive than a new entrant or trainee." Isn't it an odd way to justify legislation for inequality to start your statement with saying all things being equal? For everyone who starts at a new employment, in that sense, inexperienced, their age does not really enter into it. When we look at where the majority of young workers on these lower rates are employed, it is mainly in the food, hospitality and retail sectors. It is simply untrue to say that young workers are of less value, less productive than a colleague who is 2 years older than them. And I think it's important that we call this out and say that at the time it was a sop to the industry, to the hoteliers, the restaurants, the shopkeepers, and indeed perhaps the sector of society that the Progressive Democrats and Fianna Fáil look to for their support. But to allow it to continue with the practice of paying young workers less for their labour solely because they are young is not acceptable. It's notable that no study, no review, no peer review research was conducted by Minister Harney or the government or Fianna Fáil at the time to back up the statement that she made that these workers were of less value or less productive. It was simply stated as a justification to exclude them from the minimal protections of the Minimum Wages Act. The 2000 Act, of course, is not unique. The treatment and abuse of young people in this country did not end there. And truly, this is not a country for young people. When the recession hit, Fianna Fáil and Fianna Fáil and Green government cut job seekers' payments to under 25s, and a cut that has remained in situ in various guises. And again, it was justified at the time by saying that we needed to incentivise young people to work, to take minimum wage jobs, ironically at a time of mass unemployment. And it was allied to other job activation measures under the guise of Youth Guarantee, which was aimed at forcing young people to take up jobs or training, regardless of the suitability of them to that job or training. In reality, the policy of that and previous governments was to basically hound young people out of the country when times were hard. It was to say, off you go to Dublin Airport, cuts to unemployment rates, the so-called labour activation measures are a way to enforce a policy of mass immigration during a recession. The attitude to young people in this country continues to this day with these sub-minimum legal rates of pay. While the numbers directly on these rates may seem small, it's worth reflecting that 17,000 or so of them at present are not the same thousands that were on it 2 or 3 years ago. Since they were introduced in 2000, it is likely that hundreds of thousands of young workers have directly experienced these sub-minimum wage rates. It's also worth saying that it's not just young people who are affected. We know from trade unions and others that it's the depressing effect that these wages have on others in the sector, like retail and hospitality, where extra hours that may provide more work or extra during holiday time or peak periods is given to younger staff in order to avoid paying the full legal minimum rate to those over 20. And in these sectors, it's mainly women, migrants and vulnerable groups who dominate the employment. There's a high prevalence of part-time and precarious employment in these sectors, making it a steady exploitative industry. So these rates are used to depress the earnings of vulnerable groups, but should be of great concern to us and a reason to stop it now. We often have a picture of how employment in this country is, high-tech and high-paid and lucrative and very much a high-quality, great place to work. But the reality for hundreds of thousands is very, very different. And in the low-pay sector, women are the majority of those workers. Low pay is also allied to precarious employment, and again in Ireland we have high percentages of that employment according to Eurostat's Labour Force Survey. But the impact of low pay and precarious work is an issue for all of us, not just for those who are at the receiving end of it. Effectively, it means that ultimately the state is having to subsidise the prevalence of low pay and precarious working conditions that affect large swathes of the population. This bill doesn't address the systemic problems at the heart of that contradiction. It can only deal with one particular egregious example of the abuse of workers. But I do think it's worth saying that the reality of workers' lives in 2023 for the majority is a far cry from the rosy picture presented by this and previous governments. Earlier this year, the Council of Europe found that Ireland is in breach of labour rights obligations, and it specifically mentioned its failure to ensure a decent standard of living for young workers on the minimum wage. But it also highlighted excessive restrictions on the right to strike and access to trade union recognition. So we brought this bill here today to highlight one form of clear abuse of workers' rights. But there is a system of abuse right across many categories of employment that is at play here right throughout this country. We don't have the right to trade union recognition. We have far less rights and benefits than most other European states when it comes to paid holidays, annual leave, maternity leave, paternity leave, sick leave and other social wage benefits. And we've seen a war waged on the right to retire at a decent age and the right to a decent pension. So we in People Before Profit believe that all of these issues and struggles are linked. They're very much linked to a system that, for example, has allowed Debenhams or Cleary's workers to be abused and dismissed, and that has allowed a prevalence of low pay, precarious employment, and at the same time a system that says it is okay to pay young workers less than those they work alongside for doing exactly the same work. We're not saying that the minimum wage is an ambition or a standard to be achieved. In fact, we believe that we need to move rapidly towards a living wage and increase the benefits that all workers can earn in terms of what is called a social wage. But it is the minimum, And because it is the minimum, and it is legally the minimum, it's time to stop the discrimination that it allows and the abuse that it allows of young people.